Thank you very much, Mohammed, for the introduction. Sheikh Hamdan, Your Highnesses, Undersecretary Shah Zhang, ladies and gentlemen, President Grimson, it's good to see you here. I'm still trying to learn from Iceland about how to do more with geothermal energy in the United States. I thank you for inviting me here to address this group. And I thank the Abu Dhabi Global Environmental Data Initiative for bringing us all here. I am delighted to be part of this inaugural summit and have been asked to speak for a few moments and then to answer questions. At a meeting like this, I prefer the questions because when you give a speech, you're hoping that you'll be talking about something someone's interested in, and since most of us all know the same things, I prefer the questions. But I would like to say just a few words by way of introduction. We are brought here because of our shared imperative to build a more sustainable world, a world that finds solutions for developed and developing nations alike. In some ways, this is an incredible venue. Not so many years ago, it would have been unimaginable to have a conference focused on the need for data and measurements and action to reduce carbon emissions in the Gulf. A generation ago, it would not have happened. It is happening today because we recognize that we live in an interdependent world that is on a path that is not sustainable. The world we live in today is a fascinating place in many ways. Scientific discoveries are now largely made by international groups working together. I just was in Oman yesterday and I read the latest archaeological evidence that when people first rose on the African savanna somewhere between 150 and 200,000 years ago, they took give or take 90 to 100,000 years to get out of Africa onto the Arabian landmass, then into Europe, and then spreading across the world. Originally, it had been assumed that they hugged the edge of the peninsula. Now we know they came right across many of the mainlands. Last year we learned, or earlier this year, that with the Human Genome Project, all of us who are not 100% descended from sub-Saharan Africans, which is most of us in this room, have between 1% and 4% of our genome from our pre-human ancestors, the Neanderthals. My wife and daughter thought it was amusing that science had finally confirmed what they always knew, that I was part Neanderthal. But they were quite surprised to learn that they were also. I saw yesterday or day before in the press the latest discovery by the Kepler telescope of yet another planet outside our solar system that seems to have conditions enough like Earth that it is possible for life to exist there. Now they have identified 10. It would be interesting to know if we are not alone in the universe and if anyone else has ever confronted the challenge of climate change. Here on Earth, in ways good and bad, our borders every year look more like nets than brick walls. People, ideas, money, culture cross them at rapid speeds. So do financial crises, climate change, trafficking in people, and terror. The world, for most of us, has been pretty good, otherwise we wouldn't be here today. But it is entirely too unequal in incomes, access to education and health care and other life possibilities. Unequal both within and across national borders. You have probably all noticed that the protests in the streets are not confined to the Arab Spring. Many American cities now have the so-called Occupy Wall Street demonstrators who are protesting that in the last decade, in fact, in most of the last 30 years, income inequality and job prospects have been growing at a very rapid rate, distorting the idea of a middle-class society, which was so important to the United States. The instability of the modern world has gripped us all as we watch Europe try to come to grips with the financial crisis of the euro. But it's important not to forget that it started in the United States, then spread quickly to the UK, to Ireland, and then to our friends in Iceland. Pretty soon was going all across the world. A certain amount of instability is necessary for the creative process to work in economics and society, but too much of it freezes people up and shuts them down, and is complicating America's efforts today to deal with climate change. But most important of all, the economic model we have been following is simply not sustainable because of the way we produce and consume energy, and because of the rapid depletion of local resources, undermining the future's access to adequate levels of water and food and forests. In this context, this is a very good meeting. And those of you who are focused on giving us better data about how rapidly the oceans are rising, how rapidly the forests are disappearing, and other environmental challenges are profoundly important. The main point I want to make about this is that we are all going to be affected by things that began somewhere else. For example, I'm very worried about the rapid decline of the world's glaciers and the fact that the Greenland ice cap seems to be melting at an unsustainable rate. Greenland is a long way from here, but the ice cap on top of Greenland contains 8% of the world's fresh water. If it were to continue to melt at the rate that it is now melting, and all that fresh water falls into the North Atlantic, it could have the perverse impact of blocking the Gulf Stream, which sends warm water north in the winter. And it could recreate in some of the most productive economies in Northern Europe the climate conditions that existed 700 years ago in the Little Ice Age. So that perversely, while the rest of the world suffers the obvious and direct impacts of climate change, the winners could take out much of the economy that supports the prosperity and social cohesion that we have historically associated with Europe and Canada, and those of us who depend on them for our trade and other economic relationships. Today, I'm worried about something I rarely see in the papers about China. We know the good news about China is they're spending more than anybody else trying to develop their solar and wind resources. And the bad news is they still have horribly polluted cities, particularly the air around Beijing. And most people now in America are worried about whether China's own financial system could suffer its own crisis. Not me. I'm worried about the fact that the Yellow River, one of the two great rivers that has defined Chinese civilization, is now dry at certain parts of the year, and that the prevailing plan to deal with it is to build two gravity-powered canals from the Yangtze to the Yellow, which some Chinese engineers believe will cause both of them to run dry at significant parts of the year, with potentially calamitous consequences to China and to its neighbors to the south. Something none of us should want. There's a huge debate going on in the world today about related but different challenges of resource depletion. wildlife, forests, the capacity to grow food, the adequacy of water. The world now has 7 billion people. There is a lot of controversy about whether, for example, oil-rich countries should lease or buy farmland in Africa, which is still relatively underdeveloped and where the farmers have taken, on balance, pretty good care of the topsoil where there has not been massive deforestation. And not necessarily a bad thing, but it makes all the difference how this is done. For if you come in with money, go with heavily mechanized agriculture, and it's not sustainable, and the topsoil and the water resources are eroded, then the African continent will never catch up to the rest of the world in per capita income, and we will not do what we have to do in an interdependent world, which is to have more and more and more trading partners and more shared prosperity every year. My foundation works with a lot of those farmers. You may have seen some of the pictures on television. And there are some elemental changes which could be made in terms of seeds and fertilizer and food storage and transportation, which could make agriculture both sustainable for the Africans so that they could feed their own people and increase their incomes and increase their capacity to export. We live in an interdependent world. So the most important thing I can say today is many of you know more about the details of what you do than I do, but many of you have been my partners for many years. The fundamental decision we have to make is the one that has been before us clearly at least since 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall. We have to decide whether we are going to share the future in a positive way or through inaction or short-term attention to our own interest at the expense of others, share the future in a highly competitive but highly negative way. I believe we should choose a path of shared prosperity and shared responsibility. I think it's the only path that works. We can't get away from each other, we can't avoid each other, and we can't pretend that we are not going to be affected by events beyond our borders. No people are living with that reality more than the representatives of the island nations who are here at this conference. When I worked on the tsunami in South Asia for the United Nations for about 3 years after it struck 7 years ago and this month, I had a fascinating experience in the Maldives where they lost 64% of their GDP as a result of the tsunami because it was a chain of more than 1,000 islands where there was no natural lift from sea level over 6 meters. You're talking about prevention here. They had a seawall built around the capital city thanks to the generosity of the government of Japan, which largely protected the city from the tsunami. But they were so traumatized by what had happened elsewhere that they decided to consolidate their population in 13 of the islands, to build elevations in the center of those islands, and to become ferocious advocates of doing something serious about climate change so that the Pacific Island nations do not disappear in the next few decades because of rising ocean levels. I have had the chance to see a lot of these problems up close, and I have just a couple of observations before we go to the questions. I'm hoping that I'm still not sure I understand exactly what was agreed to in Durban and whether it lets everybody off the hook or puts more people on the hook. But of this I am certain. It does not matter what the agreements are if we do not have projects that prove the viability of taking action. The most important thing to me is proving that changing the way we produce and consume energy, changing the way we produce and consume resources, changing the way we protect them is far better economics than the current course. So most of my life is spent with people like Rick Fredrizzi, who's here, the president of the U.S. Green Building Council, who's now agreed to head the international group. There are 90 nations, I think, involved now. We just like to do things and say, if you doubt that this can be done, go look at this project, go look at that project, go see how these farmers in Africa have doubled or tripled or quadrupled their income. Look how much money is being saved by these building owners in America who have retrofitted their buildings. We have to prove that this can work. And proving it requires different strategies for developed countries, for developing countries, and for the rising economies. Let me just give you a couple of examples. I spend a great deal of my life and my foundation's time and money working in places where the incomes are less than $2 a day, often less than $1 a day. They tend to be not very big emitters of greenhouse gases now, except the methane from agricultural operations, and even there, not so much. But the populations are growing rapidly, and they need the things that we take for granted to be environmentally responsible. Just think of all the things we're taking for granted here. You would be very surprised if the microphone failed, or if the video hadn't worked, or if the lights went out, or the air conditioning failed. I spend a lot of time in places where that can't be taken for granted. The microphone failed on the new president of Haiti, while he was giving his inaugural speech. So they say to me, how can you tell us we should do green energy? We need reliable electricity. And then that raises the question, is there an economic way to do this? The answer in the Caribbean, which might be the answer in the Gulf, is yes. The Caribbean has the highest electric rates in the world. Inefficient grids, not connected, all imported energy, generating electricity, by and large from heavy fuel oil, which is heavy in carbon emissions and low in efficiency, and all imported. They could be completely energy independent through solar, through wind, through geothermal, and waste-to-energy projects, and efficiency, and it would employ many more people. But the problem in the developing world is both an absence of financing and an absence of systems that work. We have to build them the systems that you take for granted here. And so I set about trying to do that. In developed countries, we have systems. You may, I don't know what the questions are going to be, but you may want to ask me how the United States came to be the only developed country in the world where apparently you cannot win the nomination for President of the United States of one of our major parties unless you deny the reality of climate change. All I can tell you is it's not my party. The reason is as old as civilization itself. If you go back to rising civilizations that acquire great wealth and standing, they have systems. The Sumerians had systems 8,000 years ago that it lifted them above other people. And inevitably what happens is at some point there are enough beneficiaries of the system that the people running it have more interest in holding on to their present position than creating a brighter future, more interested in holding on to their gains than advancing the purposes for which the systems they created were set up in the first place. So all the developed countries have to find their way to reform. But just as in the developing countries, You have to make it economically feasible. For example, in the United States, we need jobs. For every $1 billion you spend on a coal-fired power plant in America, you get 870 jobs. For every $1 billion you spend on retrofitting a big building like the Empire State Building in New York, which my foundation had the honor to work on, you get 7,000 jobs. If you can figure out a way to finance mass retrofitting of homes in America, you can get up to 8,000 jobs per $1 billion. And it's the nearest thing America has to a free lunch. If you let the people who own the buildings pay the contractor bill back only from savings in their utility rates. You lower greenhouse gas emissions, give power back to the electric companies at a lower cost than building new power plants, and create a lot of jobs. This has nothing to do with the debate going on in America today. Why? Because the beneficiaries of the current system, especially since we found a lot of new gas and recovery techniques, have enabled us to be much more efficient in oil and gas, have made many people believe, almost as a theological proposition, that we still can't stay rich and grow richer unless we continue to put more emissions into the atmosphere. This is not, I might add, an argument against developing our petroleum resources. There are many things in the world that rest on a petroleum platform. We could all decide to drive electric cars tomorrow and we'd still need a lot of oil. But it's worth remembering. Now, the rising countries, they have a little bit of both. India, for example, still has the world's largest number of very poor people and the world's largest middle class existing in the same country. Why? Because unlike China, they're not very good at aggregating and investing capital. In other words, they don't have a good tax system. And they don't have a good infrastructure planning system, as a result of which almost 100% of the prosperity is concentrated in the 35% of the population living around their cities that are doing well. In China, they have grown well. They have been very successful in lifting people out of poverty, but their environmental, food safety, water conservation, and other systems have not kept up with that. So they're going to build canals from the Yangtze to the Yellow instead of decentralizing the population around Beijing, which I think is a more sustainable approach. Brazil, in some cases, is the most interesting of all, because Brazil has two classic cases of conflicting environmentalism. About 75 or 80% of their electricity is clean energy from hydropower. They need more power. They're growing. The problem is that the only rivers that flow fast and strong enough to generate electricity are in the rainforest, which means if they want more green power that way, they have to take down more of the rainforest, and at the largest proposed site, almost certainly destroy an Indian culture that's thousands and thousands of years old, which is now protected by law. So that after a decade in which they reduced annual rainforest destruction under the former president, Mr. Lula, by about 75% a year, they are facing now the prospect of increasing it. The other big problem they have is that for 4 years in a row now, Brazil is the only major country that has used more ethanol than gasoline in its cars. And it's the most efficient ethanol in the world, made from Brazilian sugarcane, 9.3 gallons of fuel for every gallon of oil required to produce it. The problem is not that the cane is taking the rainforest. Sugarcane requires deeper topsoil to grow, and the rainforest topsoil is very thin. But the more of the rich 20-foot deep Brazilian topsoil they take, the more they are pushing the cattle ranchers and the soybean farmers into the rainforest. even though, particularly with cattle, you can only use it for a year or two and it's no good anymore. Now, here's the hopeful thing about Brazil, and the thing I want to say to all of you. I do a lot of work in Brazil. We work with cities basically on clean transportation, waste-to-energy projects, LED lighting projects, and other things. And I've been invited down there for the last 3 years. I go down quite often, but two things in particular struck me. 2 years ago, the ethanol producers, 2,000 of them, with an economic interest in continuing what they're doing, invited me there to tell them what they could do to stop putting pressure on cattle and soybean farmers to tear the rainforest down. So unlike in my country, such a thing would be inconceivable. They say, we feel terrible about this, we want to stop. How can we do it? This year earlier, I went to Manaus, which is on the northern edge of the rainforest, and it was unbelievable. They were meeting about the conflict between the energy demands of hydroelectric power and tearing down the rainforest. And you had representatives of every oil company, every electric company, the government, the business community, the labor community, the native tribes whose long traditions and lives are at stake, the Green Party candidate for president in the last election who ran third in the election, a very strong race. And they're all sitting there talking to each other in civil tones about how they can work through this. They all recognize that for all of us, there may not be easy answers. So that's the last point I want to make. That's the model that we have to find. We have to find a way to shared responsibility and shared opportunities. Finally, let me just say this, to be a broken record. I think if we did it right, changing the way we produce and use energy, finding more efficient ways to use resources, pursuing genuinely shared responsibility instead of this dramatically rising inequality in so much of the world, would generate far more prosperity than the current course we're on. And so we all have to be prepared to experiment. I'm very proud that my presidential library was the very first building the United States government in the U.S. government building system to receive the top rating from the U.S. Green Building Council. But it's just the beginning. Every time I go there, I'm looking for something else I can do to demonstrate that this is good economics as well as saving the planet. So I ask you to think about this. It's a good thing to do in Abu Dhabi. Won the competition for the new international headquarters for building a more environmentally sustainable future with a commitment to build zero emissions buildings. All this is easier said than done, but it must be done. So far, ever since Rio 20 years ago, and ever since Kyoto, in too many places, more is said than done. The central problem with all of this energy business is the financing, because the cost of a new energy future is mostly borne up front. Then the benefits are manifested indefinitely in dramatically lower cost. Every time you double capacity in solar, the price drops 30 or 40%. Same thing is true in wind. So what we have to do is not so much have, at least in the developed and in the rising countries, working out the proper finance mechanisms is important, and having the information is important. So for those of you who are involved in that, I thank you again. I'm fairly optimistic because it seems to me that the case is so clear that this can be done, and the economic course is so much more advisable than the alternative. But there's still a lot of denial out there, and as always, the present is better organized than the future. The future doesn't have anything like the lobby that the present does. The fact that we are meeting here in Abu Dhabi is encouraging to me, And I want to thank the leaders of the UAE and indeed people all over the Gulf who are looking at this. We have come a long way, but in all the important ways, we have barely begun. Thank you very much.